Do you remember the movie Eddie and the Cruisers? Man, I loved that show when I was a teenager. And it's about basically a rock band, and it was so much fun. And so this video that I'm going to share with you today, this is not for everybody. If you loved that movie, you will probably enjoy listening to this. But more importantly, if you are interested in a discussion about the period of time, the real live period of time that this movie was kind of set in, when things were making big changes in the world of popular music. Because what I have here, it's an article that was written that it talks about the movie, but it also goes into a little bit of an analysis of what the world was like and how a band like Eddie and the Cruisers would have or could have existed during that major change that was happening back in that era in the 60s. And so, but this is the kind of thing that you're going to, if you are listening to this and you're interested in this kind of thing, this is the kind of thing you want to put on in your car when you got a few minutes, or when you have some time and you want to play it in the background so you can really listen, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff in this. Now, I've skimmed through it. I haven't read all of it, but it was fascinating enough. I thought that there would be a lot of people out there that would be interested in hearing this and kind of going through this topic. And this article was written by a guy named Michael Ventura, who is a fairly well-known author, novelist. And part of what makes this article so fascinating is he shares some of his own perspectives of his experiences during this time of great upheaval and change during the 60s. I loved this movie so much when I was a teenager. Just absolutely loved this thing. And it's really funny. I don't know if you've had this experience before, but you go back to something you haven't really looked at since you were a teenager, and then you look at it, a couple decades later as an adult, and you're like, okay. And it's just not quite what this. I had this experience with this show. I was about 15 years ago or so. I rented it because I was like, oh my gosh, I used to love that movie. And we rented it off of Amazon. I don't remember where it was, but we got the movie and I watched it, and it was still good, but it wasn't what it was when I was a teenager. But the story is cool. And if you're into this kind of thing, I think you'll enjoy listening to this. So the article itself, this was printed in LA Weekly in October of 1983. Now that's when the movie came out. I think it was in September of 83, but anyway, it was roughly just a little bit after the movie. And if you look at the picture there, if you're actually watching this, you can see a kind of a shot from the show. So it starts out with this quote that says, "Let us set out once more on our native roads, Rimbaud, a season in hell." And you remember, by the way, it's been a long time since I watched this movie. Like I said, it was 15 plus years ago. But as I recall, that was his big thing, that Eddie was trying to write this music that was going to change everything. It was going to capture some new thing, and it was called A Season in Hell. And then I think the movie is about how the tapes got lost, something like that, or somebody took them. Okay. Eddie and the Cruisers attempts sometimes deftly and sometimes crudely what no serious picture has yet attempted. It follows the life of a band, not stars, just a hardworking rock band with their hassles, their fatigues, and their moments of grace. Does the boss man like the piano man's song? Does the piano man like the lead singer's girl? Does the road manager give a about Eddie's far-out dreams? And what do they think of it all 20 years later? And when the backup singer is choreographing chorus girls in Vegas and the piano man is teaching English in a New Jersey high school, and where do their dreams walk now? That's right, because the movie starts out with them talking to, I think the guy that played the piano, kind of going and finding him and talking. It's like a reporter going and doing a report years and years after Eddie has disappeared. And I think she goes and meets these people in their current world, their current lives. The first words of Eddie and the Cruisers are, "Dark side's coming. Dark side's coming down, nothing is real." They're sung by the late and fictional Eddie Wilson. And everybody probably from that era remembers that. "Dark side's coming down, nothing is real. You'll never know just how I feel." You remember that song. It was actually a really cool tune. Let's see, as you watch the actor Michael Paré as Eddie do the song, you accept the authority of his intensity. His vibe is a little like Eddie Cochran's, but crazier. A little like Gene Vincent's, but smarter. A little like Jim Morrison's, but not as simpery. Which is to say, a little like Bruce Springsteen. Enough noise has been made about the film doing Springsteen. What hasn't been said is that Springsteen didn't come out of nowhere. He was very consciously and naturally doing an already rich tradition. And it puts in parentheses, I could walk like Brando straight into the sun, is how he put it. His sound was part of a tradition too. One thing initially exciting about Springsteen's E Street Band was that they reinstated the tenor sax, which hadn't been heard in an important new band in years, but which was the main solo instrument in the bands of the late 50s and early 60s, when this film takes place. In the days before long-winded rock solos, often the only solo on a tune was the sax, with the guitars mostly filling in licks. Springsteen brought that back. So there's a sense in which Springsteen is copying Eddie, and not the other way around. And I say this not wanting to denigrate Springsteen one bit, because to my heart, he's one of the greats, but he came from blah, 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 going to the top. Somewhere, and somewhere that he came from is what Eddie and the Cruisers is about. So, what they're saying there is that because Eddie and the Cruisers is this fictional band that exists back when that was a popular thing, it's kind of, in fiction, setting the precursor for a future Bruce Springsteen. The film dissolves from the early 1980s to the early 1960s, asking what really happened to this Eddie Wilson. Did he die in that car crash, or is he still out there somewhere? And what happened to the tapes of his never-released album, heavily influenced by the poet Rimbaud, an album that was to be called Season in Hell? Was it just loud noise, as the record company claimed, or was it years ahead of its time? And what happened to Eddie's band, the Cruisers? Through the story, the film asks a larger, more visionary question. What did it feel like when the innocent early exuberance of rock turned into something darker? And this is what I was saying that this article's about. It's that period of time. And it's so, I've had so many late night discussions with people about this topic, because it's so fascinating when you look at the early 1960s, when the Beatles rolled into the United States in 1964 with their mop tops, which looking back were some of the most innocent haircuts that any human being had ever had, but they were seen as so edgy. And you're talking just a couple of years later, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors, and the Beatles. Look at that radical change they went through, and when you recognize how short that time period was, they showed up in the United States. I think it was 64 when they were on the TV show that everybody in the world saw. Then it was 5 years later. They're getting ready to break up, and they'd gone through all those changes, and the whole world had changed in that short little period of time. And that's kind of what's fascinating about attempting to explain this time period. Okay. Visionary question. What did it feel like when the innocent early exuberance of rock turned into something darker? Did the rhythmic and lyric intensity of the music call forth from our psyches impulses and images that only rare poets had gotten to before our era, so that the music grew darkly from then on, becoming the expression of impulses that it itself had unleashed? The film doesn't ask what this meant. It asks, what did this feel like? Especially, how did it shape and shake the musicians to whom it was happening? And I know there are people that watch these videos that lived through this period. I was born at the end of it. But I mean, again, even you were Beatles, and then a few years later, Altamont. This crazy everything changing so much. Anyway, people that watch this happen, I would love to get your feedback and your comments underneath this video. This is so fascinating, this stuff, what happened here. Let's see here. Musicians to whom was happening. For plainly the music poured and still pours from musicians who aren't in control of it as much as they are trying to keep up with it, playing their music so that they themselves can hear more of it and come to understand a little and to live a little closer to what they feel. Eddie and the Cruisers is the story of such musicians, and is the first American feature worthy of their story since Jailhouse Rock. The first spoken words in the film are a voiceover to the song, the voice of an investigative journalist, Ellen Barkin, the excellent character actress of Diner, Tender Mercies, and Daniel, saying, "In the summer of '63, On the Dark Side was the #1 song in the country." Of course it wasn't, but it could have been. It is worth remembering as a litmus test to the authenticity of this picture, what was really happening to the music in the summer of 1963. Because so 63, the Beatles, they existed in England. They just hadn't come over to the United States yet, I don't think, at that point. It was 64, as I recall. But I mean, they had She Loves You, She Loves You, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that stuff was happening back in England at this period. It was very, very innocent bebop crackerjack type music. And then that's the whole point here, is that everything just changed. Okay. The astonishing variety and excitement that had poured forth from 1956 to 1960 had faded. AM radio was sticky with bubblegum. FM rock didn't exist in 63. Elvis Presley had gotten sappy. Yeah, that's right. Elvis Presley had become a movie star. And yeah, anyway, that's a whole other thing. Jerry Lee Lewis was in disgrace. Buddy Holly was dead. Carl Perkins was in obscurity. Chuck Berry's greatest period was winding down. Aretha Franklin was still 2 years or so away from making her first, scrolling to the top, first record. Atlantic Records was just gearing up to record Aretha and its other great soul artists. The only steady stream of great rock was coming out of Detroit, where Motown was still based. James Brown hadn't had a hit yet. Dylan had just come out with his Free Willin' album on Columbia, and the future of rock and roll lyrics was foreshadowed in its Hard Rain's A-Gonna Fall, the longest and most adventurous number any singer had recorded, with its cascade of surreal images written during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Dylan thought he might never get to write another song and tried to express everything inside him in one tune. That's actually really interesting. Yeah, because again, I wasn't alive during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I've talked to many people that lived during that, how just frightening that whole experience was at that time. And was that part of what created the dark energy that led to what happened by the time we got to the end of the 60s. Let's see here. Song. In another year, a few months after our fictional Eddie Wilson reported death, Dylan would pick up an electric guitar at the Newport Folk Festival and get booed off the stage for rocking it. Yeah, when Dylan went electric. Of course, Willie Dixon and Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters and Little Walter and Robert Johnson had been playing dark sounds for decades, but few American white kids were aware of that. However, in England, their music is what Mick Jagger and Eric Burdon, whose phrasing left a heavy mark on Springsteen to these ears, and that the person writing this, obviously, and their ilk were listening to hard, Jagger naming his group after Muddy Waters' tune. So soon, Jimi Hendrix would tour as lead guitar for Little Richard. That summer, many of these people at roughly the same level as our fictional Eddie and the Cruisers group, playing small clubs and tentatively exploring weirder lyrics. And that always has been kind of a fascinating thing, how all those guys over in England were listening to what the blues artists were playing here in America. They loved it, and then they repackaged it and then brought it back here and sold it. And Stones is a great example of that. Led Zeppelin actually is a great example of that type of influence. Okay. Their exploration would remain tentative for a while. The world didn't take too easily to the directions these musicians wanted. As late as the winter of 1965-66, even Dylan's phenomenal success didn't prevent a record of his getting banned across the country. The flip side of the 45 Highway 61 Revisited was a tune called Please Crawl Out Your Window, which is still nearly impossible to find. It's never even appeared on an American compilation album. Word went out among radio stations that it might be about suicide, and the tune disappeared. Its prophetic line, "Come on out the dark is just beginning," was too much for that time. And the most successful group of the decade, the Beatles, didn't start to record any lyrics heavier than "She Loves You, yeah, yeah, yeah" till 1965. Yeah, exactly. That's right. And that's what I was saying. When they came to America and they played on Ed Sullivan, "I Want to Hold Your Hand." I think that's the song they played on the show. And then it was just a few years later that they're playing Helter Skelter. Just amazing transformation in such a short period of time. Okay. All of which is to say that there could very well have been a group like Eddie and the, scrolling way up to the top, Cruisers in the summer of 1963, and we could very well have not known about it. If it wasn't for record companies scrambling to find another Beatles, it's doubtful we'd ever have heard the Rolling Stones or the Animals either. The musicians of that time were making sounds out of something that was going around, something alive in the streets, not the suburbs. because as Eddie and the Cruisers makes a point of, circa 1963, the music was still played almost solely by working class kids. It is hard to put a name on just what was alive in those streets of that summer among covens of intense friends long before the media ever got hip to it. And it's interesting when you look back at some of these bands that came out of Britain, England, even though it was a couple of decades later, still had not completely recovered from World War II. And these guys were living, I mean, you look at Black Sabbath, for example, we talk about a lot on this channel. Those guys, the story is Ozzy didn't even have a pair of shoes. These were poor people living in manufacturing towns that still hadn't completely recovered from World War II. There was a lot of poverty, and they were working class people, and the Beatles were part of that group, and Black Sabbath was part of that group, and you just go down the list, and there were tons of people like that, and that's where this music came from, in many cases. Okay, let's see, working class kids. It is hard to put a name on just what was alive in those streets of that summer I already read that. When the film's voiceover said, quote, in the summer of 63, the words put me through one of the changes that Eddie and the Cruisers' characters are always going through, blanking out on the present and seeing vividly what was in the summer of 63. We were a month or so out of high school, a few of us, mostly street kids, acting tough and doing what would later be called performance art, and at the time wasn't called anything. The dark side was coming alive in us. We could barely understand it and just tried hard to keep up with it, having no notion that the passions with which we were playing could and would drive us crazy. One night we took a very long knife and stuck it in a butcher's block and turned a spotlight on it. The audience watched, waiting for the performance. But that was the performance, just the knife in the light. First they got restless, then they heckled, then they got quiet. Then some people started to cry. Sounds so corny now, but to stare at a knife a long time in that innocent summer was also to realize that you had a knife inside you. And there was almost nothing in the culture that yet hinted that you had a knife in your heart all along. The guys in Eddie and the Cruisers are mostly working stiffs, lower class kids like us who read Rimbaud in the summer, who read Rimbaud in the summer of 63. So did we. Read him and Ginsberg and the crazier Whitman out loud, and played congas, and the only drug we did was beer, which was hallucinogenic for us, believe me. We kept on falling in love with passing beauties, but what we were really in love with was this dark side that we were finding and performing. It would turn out to be a passion we barely survived, and some of us didn't. One of us got drummed out of the Navy for being what they called homicidal and skizzy. Another died by his own hand with the name of his girl burned into his arm. Another did time, too much time, in mental hospitals. And me, I would flirt with all that and disappear, leave every word and friend I knew, wind up in Texas years later with R.D. Lang in one pocket and Gurdjieff in another. I don't know what that is. Remaking myself with the decision to be a writer. This is shorthand for a very long story. But how else to testify that this motion picture called Eddie and the Cruisers is something people really went through? And it was happening before the 60s started to happen in the media, happening without LSD or hippies or Woodstock. That stuff could only start to happen on a large scale after it had been lived in so many isolated pockets like ours. The private and the secret and the unknown had to happen first. So whatever the flaws or virtues of a film called Eddie and the Cruisers, it is not something being projected from 1983 back into the past. It is not the very pleasing and very BS or just very suburban nostalgia of American graffiti. It is a grappling with, an expression of, an elegy to something alive in a long gone summer, something which, through the musical expression of the next 2 decades, would permeate Western culture. Okay, there's just a little bit more. Got to go to the next page. Man, I hope you enjoy this. I find this idea, this topic so interesting. Okay, so we're picking back up here. Or put it this way. When Rimbaud wrote A Season in Hell in 1873, the books stayed in the cellar of a print shop for 28 years before they were distributed. Now, what he dared to explore is stacked in albums in every record store in the country, hundreds of albums by thousands of kids, which is an obvious way of saying that it's time to go in another direction. Eddie and the Cruisers takes place at a pivotal point where some loners were trying to get this stuff out there, get it among the people. True to that time, Eddie of the film isn't on any cultural mission. He just wants to play what he hears in his heart. He tells his lyricist, whom he calls Word Man, beautifully played by Tom Berenger. And then it, quote, "What I want is something that echoes. The stuff we're doing now is like somebody's bed sheets. Spread them out, soil them, ship them out to the laundry. But our songs, I want to be able to fold ourselves up in them forever." So there was a novel by somebody named P.F. Kluge, out of which Martin Davidson and Arlene Davidson wrote a screenplay, which Martin directed. I've steered away from speaking too directly about their picture because the story is so direct and simple that I speak of it in detail. That to speak of it in detail would give too much away. There are failures in it, surely. As writers, these people trap themselves into movie conventions that require laughably awkward statements and restatements of the plot, forcing characters to speak as narrators. Terrible. And no one yet in any motion picture has gotten extras in a club scene to act authentically. That's funny. I have stories about that. Okay. The phony audience responds to severe injustice to a very good music score written and performed by John Cafferty. John Cafferty, by the way, and was it John Cafferty and the Beaver Brown Band? They're the ones who did the song Dark Side. The cast gets over these hurdles with work of passionate conviction. Michael Parr as Eddie, in addition to a stunning performance, shows deep dedication to his craft in the best lip syncing I've seen or hope to see. I don't know. When I watched it, I was like, that is really, really lip syncing. Had a little to do with the music too, but. And Joe Pantoliano of Risky Business, Matthew Lawrence, David Wilson, and Michael Antunes do the up all night air of musicians perfectly. Tom Berenger carries the movie, that is, the awareness of the audience with skill and subtlety. Helen Schneider is given the worst, most impossible dialogue and survives it. Standing on line to see the picture with a lot of high school kids can only be grateful to these filmmakers because most of these kids aren't ever going to know the inner history of a cultural revolution that they can take for granted now, how it got started and who started it. And I'm going to pause there. That's my point here. That so much changed. And for somebody like me, I just showed up later. It was already done. And if you lived through this, I'd love to get your thoughts and feedback and what caused it and what happened and what you saw and what you felt and what you experienced and what it was like at school and what it was like at work, all those things, because it was a different time. Things were changing so fast. Okay, what it was made from and against what odds, what the price was and who paid it. They won't learn this in any detail from Eddie and the Cruisers, but a few of them might really get some of the spirit. And spirit is continuance. Spirit is passing on the flame. There's nothing like this on the AM radio they listen to. There's nothing like this on TV. And the studios would never produce such a film. It's left for an Embassy Pictures release of an Aurora presentation. And who knows how many desperate deal memos that refers to, i.e. some people who cared about what they were doing. It's left for them to get it out there. I won't give away any endings either, but this one's a knockout. Dialogue aside, and some of the worst is some of the last 15 minutes show close-ups that tear the heart, where from one face to another, Michael Parr's most of all, you look closer and closer at a mystery that's still walking around out there somewhere. What is the nature of this spirit that has moved us so deeply in our hearts, especially in our music, that this question should live even at the edges of a motion picture is a rarity. And the film leaves you with the sense that the secrets are still walking the streets, leaves you wondering, where does the music walk now? Has it been crippled for keeps, paralyzed, like a lot of people have been saying? Or is it like Rimbaud once put it, that the paralytic who was lying on his side rose, and they, the damned, saw that it was with a singularity firm step that he crossed the gallery and disappeared into the city. Anyway, I loved this movie so much. And it's so interesting to listen to this author talk a little bit about, from this author's perspective, what that was like going through that period of time when things were going through that dramatic change. And again, I know I've said this a couple times already in this video, but if you experienced this, I would love to hear your thoughts on what it was all about and what that was like. And this movie that tried to capture it. Did you see this movie and did you like this movie? What were your thoughts when you saw this originally? And how'd you feel about that? Anyway, of course, follow the channel, like the video. If you know other people who'd be interested in this, please share it with them. And as always, have yourself a fantastic day.